Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to turn our attention to Chapter 2, which focuses on the philosophy and the history of the correctional system as we know it here in the United States. As you are aware, the majority of our legal and governmental foundation comes directly from our English ancestors. Our punishment philosophies follow suit, and we see many of our correctional structures based on English prisons. In this lecture, we are going to examine the main punishment philosophies that we continue to use today, which ones work and which ones don't. Then we're going to look at the history of the prison system and the physical structures of the prisons themselves. Then we're going to end with a glance at different theoretical models of imprisonment and how that influences inmate behaviors. So let's go ahead and get started. Evidence for natural law can be found in the universal human revulsion against specific negative behaviors or crimes, like murder, incest, or even theft. But in the United States, there has been a call for reform on the punishment of some crimes, such as drug offenses, due to the lack of progression in terms of the severity and the duration of the punishments that are associated with these crimes. For instance, our prison system has continuously been shown to be ineffective. If you are going to call a system correctional in nature, then that system has to actually correct behavior. But we are seeing high rates of reincarceration, so the system is not doing what it's supposed to do. There is no rehabilitation or reformation of the offender. So of course they're going to come back after a short period of time spent on the outside. Based on that failure, there are many out there that want to change the way that people are punished and to increase the amount of treatment that inmates receive. Many laws and punishments are set up on at least one of these 5 main punishment philosophies. Retribution has always been popular. Trying to extract the payment of debt to society and sort of recompense for one's criminal offense. Retribution is based on the belief that crime sort of arouses the anger of the entire community, and the only way to reduce that anger is to punish and almost destroy the offender in the process. We know that retribution doesn't work, and it only makes offenders angrier and more likely to recidivate. Incapacitation has also been very popular as it leaves the offender unable to act while incarcerated and successfully prevents an offender from victimizing other members of society. But it does not stop inmates from offending against one another, and it only works while the offender is incarcerated. But the biggest two that we flip-flop back and forth on are deterrence and rehabilitation. Deterrence theory suggests that offenders are discouraged from committing crime because of the fear of its consequences, meaning the punishment. There are 2 different types of deterrence, specific and general deterrence. This suggests that we are personally deterred when we are personally affected by punishment or when we see others being punished for their crimes. The death penalty is built around the deterrence principle. But we know that these types of punishments are not effective, and if anything, they actually cause increases in crime. The other philosophy rests in the idea of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation comes in all shapes and sizes. There, of course, is the necessary items for things like substance abuse and anger management, but then there are also programs that help inmates to contribute back to society. Educational programs used to exist. Inmates could get a GED, or sometimes they could even get their doctoral degree from prison. However, these days are long behind us since there is no money to help inmates get an education. There are new prison programs instead popping up again and again, like Paws on Parole or Puppies in Prison, where inmates can train service dogs or dogs that can then go up for adoption. This provides the inmate the opportunity to give back to the community that they offended against and to show them that they have more to offer than just a life of crime. Although rehabilitative programs cost more and many people are reluctant to actually implement them, research does show that inmates have lower rates of recidivism when they go through rehabilitative programs than if they were to just sit in prison. The formation of the prison system here in the U.S. was based entirely on rehabilitation, but the prison founders actually called it something else. They called it penance. Taking the root of the word penance, meaning to be punished for having done something wrong, the prison founders set up a system that was centered around rehabilitation through religious reflection and mediation. William Penn established what would become Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Penn was a Quaker, and if you don't know anything about Quakers, they're actually a very non-violent type of people. They're sort of like the Amish, but they're not opposed to modern conveniences in any way. However, they are opposed to any form of slavery. They refuse to participate in war. They dress very plainly. They refuse to swear any oaths, and they are also teetotalers, which means that they don't drink any alcohol of any kind. Quakers were very modern in their treatment of medical illnesses and mental illnesses, especially for the time period. They very much were advocating for the decriminalization of the insane, which meant that they wanted to avoid incarceration and punishment if it could be avoided. If it couldn't be avoided, then we needed to make prison about something more than just keeping people chained up all day or punished publicly. The prisoners actually needed to be reformed. William Penn advocated for what we now call the Pennsylvania system. This was a system marked by isolation and labor. The inmates were not supposed to talk to one another or be able to identify one another. This was accomplished by the hood that the inmates would wear when they weren't in their cells. As you can see in the picture, the inmate is standing in his prison cell wearing his hood. This is just an example, but when they were in their cell, they weren't necessarily required to wear them. They only had to wear them outside the cell. However, the cell, as shown in this picture, is very bare bones. There were no amenities at all. The thought was that if you left prisoners in isolation long enough, then they would have plenty of time to repent and think about what they did wrong. However, as we know, solitary isolation comes with a variety of concern for the mental health status of the inmate. This is actually a drawing of the original prison, Eastern State Penitentiary, as I mentioned before. The prison was located in the middle of Philadelphia and had a big brick wall to keep the inmates inside of the prison. The wall itself went around the perimeter of the facility, and from this picture you can see the interior structure of the prison itself. It's actually a spoke and wheel look with the center being the main interior of the prison. This is an alternative look of the prison from the floor plans. You'll see here that there are 7 cell blocks full of individual cells. The original prison was only comprised of 5 cell blocks, but they later had to expand due to overcrowding issues. Each of these cells shows cell blocks shows an individual cell. This means that each prisoner got their own individual space. There was no double or triple bunking like we see today. This was the outside of the prison from a modern perspective. You can see that the door is there. This is the entryway to the penitentiary. The red door is the only way for the tourists to go in and out of the establishment. And once you're through that door, you're going to branch off onto the tour. Not every part of the prison is available to the general public, and there are certain areas that are considered to be more haunted than others. The tour will take you through a restored portion of the prison, and you'll be allowed to go into the cells and through other hallways throughout the prison itself. This is a picture of the prison gargoyles. Their names are Frank and Carson, and they are set up to guard the entryway of the prison. Each one of them are about 6 foot tall or a little higher, and they weigh about 300 pounds each. They're solid concrete. They are only outside the prison at Halloween time, and they stay up through the fall season. If you look at the hands and the feet of the gargoyles, they're holding chains, and those are meant to represent the prison guards who used to work there. Frank and Carson are overlooking the prison, and they keep an eye on all visitors who come through the doors. If you are interested, the prison gift shop actually sells plush replicas of these two. This is a picture of cell block number 4, and you can see here that there's a little meal cart. Because the prison was a separate structure and everybody was isolated, this meant that they ate their meals inside their cells. So someone would come bring the meals down on these little carts, and they would give them to the inmates inside. When mealtime was over, the same individual would come and collect all of the trays. This is a picture of the unrestored cell block number 5. If you look at this prison, it's really quite beautiful. I know it's run down now, but at the time it was very beautiful. It's in need of some major overhaul, but it's quite modern for the time period that we're talking about. Most jails and prisons at the time were very dark, and they did not have this level of natural sunlight. Part of the penitent nature of the prison allowed prisoners to have some exposure to the outside world, even if they were isolated for most of the day. This meant that they had sunlight in the hallways and in their cells too. The architecture was in part due to religious influence, and that's why there's so many dramatic archways. And if you really look at it, it has almost a cathedral type of feeling to it when you're inside. But one other trivia note of interest, Eastern State Penitentiary was one of the first structures to have running water. ESP actually had running water even before the White House did. This picture was taken in 1879, shortly after cell block number 9 started to be used for inmates. This is one of the newer additions. They were much better cells in these 2 additional cell blocks than were in the original cells. You can see that the food carts and the original doors are present. Each of these doors belong to a single person cell, as I mentioned before. And this is a picture of an abandoned cell. It was not renovated in any way. You can see the skylight that I referenced earlier. It wasn't a ton of sun, but the inmates would be able to see the daylight somewhat and get some natural sunlight in their cell. Remember that at the time there was no electricity throughout the prison, so the need for light was crucial, hence these skylights. The space is not that large, but it was a lot bigger than modern cell sizes. Do you think that you could live here? This is actually a perfect segue to show you a picture of a newly renovated cell. This is what a typical cell would look like when the prison was brand new, aside from the stucco walls, of course. They would have had brick like the abandoned cell did. This stucco was part of the renovation as well. The cells had flushing toilets and indoor plumbing, and the prison also had central heat, which made winters in Philadelphia rather comfortable. This is a picture of the most famous cell in Eastern State Penitentiary. This prison cell belonged to Al Capone, and he used it during his first prison stay. He was incarcerated at ESP for 8 months for a conviction of carrying a concealed deadly weapon, but it really was after this first prison stay when he became public enemy number 1, and he became the Al Capone that we all know today. Al Capone was only ever convicted on tax evasion charges and the bootlegging that he engaged in, but never for the murders that he has been attributed to. Capone was an inmate at some of the most notorious prisons at the time, including USP Atlanta and USP Alcatraz, both federal institutions. And it was when he was transferred to Alcatraz that it became clear, I mean, if it wasn't before from the look of this picture, that he was favored by the correctional officials who supervised him and the other inmates. His prison cell still looks this way today, and you can see all of the original furniture that he actually used at the time. This is a picture of the center spoke of the prison. Remember back to when we started the lecture, how the cell blocks actually spoked off from the center of the wheel. It was in this center of the wheel where the correctional officers would stay during their shifts. There were no such thing as surveillance cameras at the time, so instead the correctional officers had to use surveillance mirrors. And the prison was built with central surveillance in mind. Before they had video cameras to monitor the cell blocks, the officers had to use these mirrors. By looking through the angled mirrors, the officers would be able to see down the cell blocks and see what was going on without the inmate having the same view. In addition, each of the prison cell blocks would have a door attached to them so that if something were to happen down one of the cell blocks, they could lock things down easily if a riot were to break out. A lot of prisons still use the centralized structure for that reason. This structure allowed for widespread surveillance without having to make the rounds every moment of the day. The last thing that I want to show you is a picture of the Klondike. This was known as the shoe or the hole. It's a prison within a prison, essentially, otherwise known as solitary confinement. These were very dark cells. They didn't have any skylights, and unfortunately I don't have any additional pictures to show you from inside the hole, but you can see them specifically as part of the prison within a prison tour if you go to ESP. These were isolated, and the wing was sort of over by the side. This was the area for those who broke the rules. You knew it was bad if you broke the rules, but how much worse do you think it would have gotten if you were already in solitary confinement to begin with? How do they punish you even further than that? Eastern State Penitentiary is no longer in operation, but it remains one of the best examples of the Pennsylvania system that we have to date. In contrast, the Auburn system was the competing prison system, and it made efforts to evolve from the solitary confinement that was used by the Pennsylvania system. Instead, the Auburn system took additional steps to strip away the inmate's individuality. For instance, we see the first use of real prison uniforms. Inmates were not allowed the freedom to eat where they wanted or even to talk during meal times. And additionally, there were strict measures to make sure that inmates marched in silence and in compliance with the prison operations. This technique was called lockstep. This picture shows you two things. First, you can see the prisoners are wearing striped uniforms. Everyone is wearing the exact same thing from hat to shoes. They're also walking in lockstep formation, which would require the inmate to hold one arm against his chest and to place the other arm on the shoulder of the inmate who was directly in front of him. This formation allowed for one correctional officer to monitor somewhere between 10 and 20 men at a time without the inmates getting out of line. This is a secondary photograph of prisoners who are walking in lockstep at Colorado State Penitentiary. The picture dated somewhere between 1898 and 1900. You can see the same things that I was just talking about in terms of the uniforms and the correctional officer. Although both prison systems were somewhat progressive for their time, they are not without their criticisms. The Pennsylvania system's use of solitary confinement was expensive to build and to operate. The prison was very quickly becoming overwhelmed with inmates. There weren't enough cells for the amount of inmates that they were trying to house there. In addition, prison officials quickly learned something that we acknowledge today, that solitary confinement leads to mental health issues for the inmates that are housed in that way. The Auburn system, on the other hand, was criticized for many of the things that we do in prison today, causing the inmates to lose their sense of self. The inmates were required to wear uniforms, remain silent for a large part of the day, and they would be required to perform different sets of laborious tasks. They were required to make nails, barrels, clothing, shoes and boots, carpet, buttons, carpenter's tools, steam engines, and boilers, and a bunch of other things. They were also very brutally disciplined. They were whipped and lashed and flogged for often very minor infractions, and then they would not receive any sort of medical attention, or if they did, it was very limited. So many of these individuals died from infection. They were also subjected to shower baths, which occurred when the prisoner would be stripped naked. They would be bound at the hands and the feet, and a wooden collar would be placed around their neck to prevent the inmate from turning his head. Then ice cold water would be poured over the inmate nonstop. Finally, I want to end the lecture today by talking about two theories of inmate behavior that have been developed based on the prison environment and the way that inmates interact with one another. The first that I want to talk about is Clemmer's notion of prisonization. Prison is a foreign environment to anybody who has not been there before. For a lot of first-time inmates, they're often struggling to adapt to a life in a prison environment. But when prisonization takes place, the inmate becomes a convict. They are no longer part of a free society, but they have been brought into the prison lifestyle. They take on the inmate code. The things that are not acceptable in the free world are often rewarded inside prison. The longer that you are incarcerated, the more prisonized you become. Inmates become hardened. They begin to think of the COs as their enemy. They keep to their own racial group and are distrustful to outsiders, and they absolutely despise snitches. In contrast to Clemmer's prisonization, CRIJ's deprivation model states that prisoners are a microcosm of regular society and that things happen inside this environment that are necessary in order to survive the experience. CRIJ states that prisons are built off of a reward system and that even the smallest rewards can induce an inmate to comply with correctional officers or with other inmates who have a better position in the social order. But in order for an inmate to truly be deprived enough to want to comply with correctional officers or with stronger inmates, 5 deprivations or pains of imprisonment must occur first. First, the deprivation of liberty refers not only to the loss of civil rights, both temporary and permanent, but also to the loss of ability within the institution to decide on such matters as when to sleep, what you want to eat, when you want to shower, what kind of work you want to do, or any sort of recreation. The deprivation of goods and services refers to the manner in which inmates are deprived of goods and services that they could obtain in the community if they were free. The deprivation of heterosexual relationships refers to the lack of female companionship in prison. The only available sexual outlet for men in prison is other men, which can lead to inmates who so participate to question their masculinity. The deprivation of autonomy can be understood as a result of the deprivation of liberty. As inmates realize that they cannot make basic choices for themselves, they also come to realize that officials in the institution have complete control over them. Lastly, inmates experience the deprivation of security, which refers to the potential threat to personal safety that exists for inmates while they are inside the prison. Once these 5 deprivations have occurred enough in the inmate's life, then he or she will be compliant in order to not lose whatever little rewards they are able to hold on to. One of the biggest things that we have seen occurring in the last few decades is a pretty radical shift from a rehabilitative prison model to a deterrence-based or retributive model. The 1960s and 70s were marked by rehabilitation and educational programs. Then in the 1980s, we see a definitive change in the legal and social landscape of our country. One of the biggest shifts took place during the Reagan administration, in which we saw a shift taking place towards the conservative side of the aisle, which is noted for its tough on crime policies and approaches. Think about what might be one of the biggest domestic policies that occurred during the Reagan administration. If you're thinking about the expansion on the war on drugs, then you would be correct. But in addition to the significant crackdown on drug use, possession, and distribution, we also see a significant tightening of the proverbial noose regarding laws affecting sentencing. The Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, also bearing the mark of the Reagan administration, essentially created a stricter legal environment for those offenders who were involved in the criminal justice system. At the time of the biggest items, one of the biggest items rather, was that was targeted was the use of parole. Several high-profile offenses took place shortly after the passage of this act, in which parolees out on parole or out on furlough committed some pretty graphic, violent crimes while they were on release. These offenses allowed for the government to be able to point a finger at the offenders and sound the rallying cry for tighter restrictions on inmate movements and their ability to get out of prison early. What the Sentencing Reform Act did was it basically abolished parole at the federal level for any inmates who were sentenced after the passage of the law. So in theory, there are no more federal parolees in the system except for those who are remaining who were grandfathered in before the passage of the law. By eliminating parole, the act also eliminated the indeterminate sentencing structure that the federal government used. Before, you would be sentenced to 15 to 30 years, and after 15, you might get out on parole. Now you're serving 85% or more of that same 30-year sentence while accounting for good time. But even then, the good time credits became more limited, and they could be used as a punishment mechanism for the inmates if they broke any rules. By being tough on crime, acts like this one also kept prisons fuller for longer. If no one is being released, and everybody is serving more and more of their sentences, what is this eventually going to lead to? If you said overcrowding, then you would be right. Notably, when this happens and prisons are over capacity by an extreme amount, then you see massive releases like the state of California has had to do in the past in an attempt to level out their overcrowding problems. This lecture took a little bit different of approach than what we are going to be typically covering this semester. Today we focused on the evolution of the prison system in terms of the physical and social structure, and in terms of the design elements that we saw the two original prison systems use. Of course, all things must evolve in order to survive, and the American prison system is no different. Next time we're going to dive into the legal protections and the safeguards that inmates have in this country. Meet me back here next time as we explore Chapter 3, the Law and Corrections.